du vol.
Oui. J'ai commencé déjà.
C'est vrai? T'es où?
Comment?
T'es où?
Dans le livre?
Ouais.
À peu près la moitié.
C'est vrai?
Oui.
On doit finir jusqu'à quand?
Je sais pas.
Oui,
je sais pas sûr.
We'll start have a week where we will speak about the novels. The idea is to give you some context so you're able to understand the novels. You really have the historical context for them. So the plan for today is to continue what we've been doing, that is to continue talking about Australian history so you have basic knowledge of Australian history to understand the novels. And then we'll talk as well about settler colonialism, because if you've started reading the novels, you will have seen that the novels deal very much with the specificity of settler colonialism. So that's what we'll talk about today. So as you can see, we'll first start by finishing that introduction to Australian history, and then we'll talk about things connected to settler colonialism. So last week we finished by talking, we finished the class. Towards the end of the class, I talked about the first fleet. Okay, if you remember, I asked you to take. So last week I asked you to follow Australian history by using the first document we So we talked about Aboriginal presence in Australia, which is obviously much longer than European presence, much more varied as well. You remember that Aboriginal people include between 250 to 300 nations, and therefore the same number of languages. And we finished last week by talking about the first fleet. That was sent to Australia mostly to create a penal colony. So I've shown you last week. Alright, this is what we finished on. You remember we talked about the number of people that started in Portsmouth and the number of people that arrived in Port Jackson. Now, Australia was colonised very progressively. This is something that you need to keep in mind when you read The Secret River, when you read Remembering Babylon. Remember that Australia is 14 times the size of France. Australia was colonised starting in Sydney, what is today Sydney. Colonisation remained very close to Sydney for a long time for lots of different reasons. The first one is that this was a penal settlement, so the idea was not to spread, so it would be more difficult to manage prisoners. Okay, the idea was actually to keep to certain areas. The other problem is that there's a range of mountains not very far from Sydney, which are called the Blue Mountains. Because they look blue from far. A little bit like la ligne bleue des Vosges, and basically the Blue Mountains were a very difficult mountain range to go through for most colonizers. So it actually took more than 50 years for colonizers to find a way through the Blue Mountains to the valleys on the other side, which are actually quite good for agriculture. But originally it was quite difficult to spread. So colonization was very much limited to Sydney in the early years. At least for 30 years, it was very much limited to a very small part of what is today Sydney, mostly the harbour and the airport, if you've ever been there. And then colonization extended to this island, to Tasmania, which had, I'll show you a geographical specificity. There's a peninsula in Tasmania that was very useful as a prison. Une péninsule très particulière qui est très intéressante en point de vue naturel pour faire une prison. So that's why you had colonization that expanded, and then the rest of colonization expanded a little bit like this, very progressively. The interior of the country took a long time to colonize. Okay, so Obviously, you don't need to have all of the details about this, just keep in mind that it was extremely progressive. He started the Secret River, because in the Secret River, the main character arrives in Sydney, and then he moves up the Hawkesbury. So he goes through the ocean into the Hawkesbury River, which is not actually that far, but it was very difficult at the time to navigate. Obviously, it's much more dangerous to navigate the ocean than it is to navigate a river. So just to give you an idea, this is not necessarily something you need to know, this is background. The colony, remember that at the time, Australia was a series of colonies, that is, they were almost separate countries. So the colony of New South Wales was created in 1788 with the First Fleet. The next colony to be officially created was Tasmania in 1825. C'est un petit peu trompeur ici, la Tasmanie ça a en fait été établie en 1803, sauf qu'à l'époque ça faisait partie de la même colonie que la Nouvelle-Galles du Sud. Donc pas hyper pratique au niveau, communication, c'est quand même super loin. La Tasmanie c'est en face de Melbourne ça met quand même beaucoup, enfin, je sais pas, 7-8 heures de ferry pour y aller, d'accord, donc le Sydney c'est pas pratique. Mais la colonie séparée a été créée en 1825. WA, so Western Australia, this section of Australia was created in 1829, but again, at the time, it was just a tiny colony next to what is today Perth. Okay, very, very small. You have to consider how long a process colonization is. And then you've got South Australia, 1836. South Australia, ici. Victoria, 1851, that's the area around Melbourne. Queensland in 1859. So Queensland is roughly this section of Australia in the northeast. And then finally, the Northern Territory. You remember there are two territories in Australia. Northern Territory, the Australian Capital Territory, were created in 1911. Just to give you an idea of how long it took, you can see that it took, what's this? Almost a century, 80 years, from the creation of the first colony to the creation of the last one. A very, very slow process. In 1859, Queensland was not colonized entirely. So the maps I'm showing you now are a little bit misleading. D'accord, elles sont un peu trompeuses les cartes, parce qu'en 1788, vous avez l'impression que vous avez tout le New South Wales qui est colonisé. En fait, vous avez vraiment Botany Bay, The Rocks, c'est-à-dire l'hypercentre de Sydney aujourd'hui, qui est colonisé. Enfin, en fait, vous avez juste un tampon en 1788. So you can see here, 1788, you've got, New South Wales, then the creation of Tasmania, Western Australia, the creation of South Australia, Victoria, then you've got the creation of Queensland. Here, vous pouvez voir que ça séparait en fait la Nouvelle-Galles du Sud entre ça et ça, parce qu'en fait on ne savait pas forcément, ça a mis très très longtemps de traverser le continent australien. Il y a énormément d'explorateurs qui sont morts dans le désert en essayant de faire une traversée. En fait, ils ne savaient pas jusqu'où ils allaient, et comme c'est un désert immense, il y en a beaucoup qui sont morts là-dedans. Donc en fait, ça c'est plutôt, on va dire, une convention que c'était la Nouvelle-Galles du Sud que ça a été réellement. And then finally, after 1911, you can see the name of the final states, with this part of New South Wales being transformed into the Northern Territory. So, just a couple of words about the penal system, because this is addressed in the Secret River, not in the other works that we'll be dealing with. What you need to know about the penal colony first is how the prisoners were called. The term for prisoners was convict. No, of course you can call them prisoners, but the term used at the time, the term you'll find in the novel, etc., is convict. The people that were sent to Australia, as you can see from the fleet, were mostly convicts, but there was also a lot of administrative staff that was sent, because obviously you needed people to check on what the convicts were doing. So you had soldiers, you had la personne qui gère une colonie au nom de Londres, ça s'appelle un governor. D'accord, donc si vous avez des références au governor, c'est cette personne-là, en fait c'est la personne qui a le plus de pouvoir, entre guillemets, dans une colonie, qui est censée répondre à Londres, mais comme en Australie, ça met un peu 6 mois pour les lettres arriver au Royaume-Uni, dans une décision, on voit 6 mois pour revenir, il ne fallait pas trop attendre les décisions longues quand même. So you also had priests, a number of people that were religious. The idea was to give some structure for the convicts. Hey, you know that in prisons there were often religious people that were there to help convicts go over their negative past. The convicts themselves could go from people that had committed very serious crimes, but the vast majority of people that were sent to Australia were people that had committed very small crimes. In particular, people that had done stealing. So some of the poorer populations in the UK that might have stolen, some people were deported to Australia for bread, okay, for having stolen bread. I'm not sure how much you've read of the Secret River, but in the Secret River he gets deported for a bit more, but still theft. And in fact, there were also political prisoners that were sent, in particular Irish people that were sent to Australia. There's quite a big Irish population in Australia today. What is essential to understand about the convicts is that, except for the convicts who committed more crimes in Australia, the convicts were not actually locked in Australia. Okay? Because you're 20,000 kilometres away from the UK, in a hostile environment, there was no need to lock up the prisoners. What would happen most of the time is that the prisoners would be employed by free colonists. That'd be free settlers, or by the administration. Okay, so most of the convicts, on est d'accord que quand vous êtes à 20 000 km du Royaume-Uni, de toute façon vous ne pouvez pas partir, le pays plus proche, il est à l'époque, il y a plus de 10 d'heures de bateau dans des mers qui sont particulièrement dangereuses. Vous n'avez pas besoin d'enfermer les gens, d'accord? Donc l'endroit lui-même sert de prison en tant qu'endroit de par comment il est fait. Donc c'était pas des personnes qui étaient enfermées à part ceux qui récidivaient. Eux ils étaient enfermés, eux ils étaient soumis à un système de prison comme celui qu'on connaît nous, on va dire. Mais en Australie en fait les prisonniers étaient en général, ils devenaient des employés des personnes qui en avaient besoin sur place. Donc par exemple, un soldat, enfin en général c'est plutôt des gens de gradés ou pas forcément des soldats, on va dire le governor par exemple avait toujours des prisonniers qui allaient s'occuper de son jardin, qui allaient s'occuper de sa maison, de sa cuisine, de cuisiner des légumes, des choses comme ça, qui allaient aider en particulier les prisonniers qui ont beaucoup aidé à la construction des routes, à la construction des bâtiments, qui avaient tout à créer, d'accord? So basically the convicts would work under contract, and once they had worked for say 5 years or 10 years, depending on how much they were convicted for, they would then become free. Okay, so this is what is talked about in the Secret River. I don't want to spoil it before next week, but you've got some prisoners that are employed by some people, you've got some people that were prisoners that become free settlers, and you also have the idea that there was a very strong argument in Australia in the early years of the 19th century. Some of the free settlers wanted there to be a clear difference from convicts that became free. Okay, so you had some people, well, mostly the people that came free to Australia, who wanted to be a separate class, if you want, to be considered as being the right colonizers, if you want, and to be separate, to be considered separate from a population that has become free, that were originally convicts. Okay, so you also have this debate about legitimacy of people that were convicts that then become free, trying to create a sort of aura around them or trying to hide their convict past. So I just cut you a couple of images. So you can see here convicts here dragging wood to build usually buildings. They were building a lot of roads, a lot of bridges as well. You can see that here, and here you can see a convict being punished for not doing his work. And this is the prison in Tasmania, Port Arthur, which today is a museum, but Tasmania was very interesting as a prison. À l'époque, ça s'appelle, je l'ai dit la semaine dernière, Van Diemen's Land. Je l'ai dit la semaine dernière, ouais. Il y a un moment, je sais plus trop. But Port Arthur is very interesting because in Tasmania, it's a peninsula that has a very short entrance, a very narrow entrance. That narrow entrance is a couple of 100 meters wide. Okay, I think it's about 200 meters wide, and the peninsula itself has cliffs all around it. So in a way, that peninsula is a natural prison. Okay, you just have to close that small access, those 200 meters of very narrow access to the peninsula, to actually have prisoners that are surrounded by cliffs. D'accord, ça vous fait un truc comme ça. Voilà, superbe dessin. Ouais, on va dire c'est comme ça, hein. Voilà, à peu près. Je m'excuse, j'ai pas beaucoup de talent de dessin. Mais en gros, vous avez un seul accès qui représente à peu près juste 200 mètres, et tout ça, c'est des falaises. C'est une prison naturelle, en fait. And this was the worst place to go in Australia. It was the toughest prison in Australia. So this debate that I talked about between those that wanted free settlers to be separate and those that wanted free convicts no longer to be considered as former convicts is known under the term emancipists versus exclusives. D'accord? Donc ceux qui voulaient que les prisonniers ne soient plus considérés comme étant, enfin, soient vraiment intégrés à la place des personnes libres, c'était bien sûr les emancipists, et ceux qui voulaient les considérer comme une classe à part et une classe un peu inférieure de la société, c'était les exclusives. D'accord? And not all, in terms of main convict colonies, not all of the colonies were actually convict colonies. New South Wales, Tasmania, that we'll be talking about, were convict colonies, but some colonies never had any convicts. In particular, South Australia never had any convicts, and WA had some convicts, but it was not created as a penal colony. What you guys need to have in mind is this, the end of the convict system. Vous pouvez fermer les rideaux, hein, si ça vous dérange, faites vos vies. What you need to keep in mind is the end of the convict system. Now on est dans une grotte maintenant. The end of the convict system took place. This will be important for the Secret River. It took place in 1840 in New South Wales. Again, these were separate colonies. Okay, so depending on the colony, there will be a different date for the end of the convict system. So 1840 for New South Wales, and all of the Australian colonies ended the deportation system in 1868. Okay, so when you read The Secret Ripper, have these dates in mind, sort of, that this takes place around the middle of the 19th century, because this is when Australia shifted from being a penal colony to being a more attractive colony. Final thing I want to mention about this early period of Australia is the opposition, well, not the opposition, is those two terms, squatters and pastoralists. I asked you at home to read the glossary, I think, yes? You had those terms in the glossary. This is mostly about how colonisation took place in Australia. The pastoralists in Australia is the name for the very large landowners. Okay, so really, really rich landowners in Australia are called pastoralists. And most of those pastoralists were originally what we call squatters. That is, that they would leave the place where they arrived in Australia. These people could be former convicts, they could be free settlers, but these people would leave, would go to a land that they found appropriate, they would squat that land, and then they would ask the government to recognize that this was their land. Okay, so you had, if you want, a very unordered form of colonization in a lot of parts in Australia of people informally squatting on the land and then asking the government to recognize this. This, of course, is connected to the size of the country. Okay, Australia was so big, if you needed 3 days of horse riding to go somewhere, obviously you would not go, plant a flag, go back to Sydney to get the administration to validate your plot of land. So you would go, build something, start agriculture, start a business, and then you would actually get approval for this. But you'll see again that, in particular in the Secret River, you've got a description of squatter life, of people that were squatting land and trying to get recognition for this. And of course, you've got a number of pastoralists in that novel. One more thing to say about colonial Australia is the fact that there were a number of gold rushes that started in 1851 in Australia. This was a very important moment for two reasons. The first one is that it transformed Australia from an unwanted penal settlement with a terrible reputation into a very desirable location, okay? Because you could go to Australia, find gold, and make money very quickly. So you've got a very clear transformation of the reputation of Australia around the 1850s, 1860s, from the worst place on earth where you could be sent to the most desirable, well not most desirable, but to a very desirable place. The other consequence, as I'm sure you can imagine, is in demographic terms, in terms of population. Before 1851, it was very difficult to get free settlers to come to Australia. Quand personne n'avait envie, genre, de tous les endroits dans un empire où vous pouviez aller dans la colonie pénitentiaire, c'était pas particulièrement souhaitable. Bien sûr, with the gold rush, you had more people wanting to go. In fact, you had a huge boom. The population in Australia doubled, tripled very quickly within a decade or less. And of course, this brought a lot of variety in the population of Australia. There were people from all over the world, from Germany, people from from the US, the colonies, people from China, people from lots of parts of the world that came to basically try to get some gold. This in Australia led to a number of restrictive laws against, in particular, the Chinese. Okay, there were a lot of restrictive laws in the gold fields on what the Chinese could do. It is a huge variety of population arriving, leading in Australia to very anti-foreign laws by some of the British colonists. Which was actually the case everywhere. In the US, you had anti-Chinese laws throughout the 19th century. Okay, it was not crazy. It was not an exception at the time at all. Okay, so you can see here just an illustration of a settlement, a settler building their own shack, their own house on a plot of land. And this is actually, I'm not sure if you've seen photos of Sydney, but if you have, they look nothing like this. This is an illustration of early Sydney. And you can see all the way at the back here, the governor's house. It's pretty fancy. It's very funny when you go to Australia and you have a look at historical buildings, they look pretty crap. They're just four walls and a roof, basically, because these were built mostly by soldiers, by admin staff, and by convicts. So you've got no real flourish in the architecture as you might have in some other countries. Alright, so let's talk briefly about the two other major periods in Australian history. So as I mentioned, and as you can see in your timeline, in 1901 Australia became independent. Technically it was a dominion, but it had a form of independence. And Australia, when it became independent, actually federated all of the colonies that were there. You remember the 6 colonies, New South Wales, Tasmania, Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, Queensland, federated into one nation. The first decision they took was to limit immigration to Australia to white people only. This is what we call by the White Australia policy. This is what you have in your fascicule. There you are, Australia under the White Australia policy. Okay, so you can see the name of the act that enabled this legislation was very clearly called the Immigration Restriction Act. The idea was basically to keep Australia British, to have English as the major language, for people to have British culture, mostly because Australia was still part of the British Empire, and Australia felt a connection, well, the politicians that decided this felt a connection with Britain and wanted to maintain it. They were also taking the example of the US, which they saw as a really bad example. In the US, you had a lot of variety of population, in particular with the slave population, and this had led to a civil war. So to Australians, only a country that was not multiracial could be a harmonious country. Okay, so obviously these were the beliefs of the time. And so therefore Australia decided to have a truly British identity. This, as you can see, was in force until 1972. It was actually relaxed from the 1940s onwards. Okay, so the last 30 years of Australia under the White Australia policy was actually less restrictive, but the first 30 years were extremely restrictive. There are a lot of stories of Chinese people that had lived their whole lives in Australia that went to see their families, their extended families in China, were never readmitted into Australia. Okay, so it was very, very strong from 1901 until the 1930s. From the 1940s onwards, with the impact of World War II, it became more and more difficult to defend such a very racist policy. At the time, it became very embarrassing to the point that Australia had too much pressure and needed more population. It really needed to open up. Qu'est-ce que je nous ai mis? Fiche that up. Okay, so you can see this is just an image. This is the opening of the first parliament in 1901 in Melbourne. So you can see the grand sort of representation here. You know, the light is shining in all the right places. Which leads me to the last section. Multicultural Australia. Which started from 1973 onwards. Australia is still today officially a multicultural country. That is that Australia pretty much did a reverse, a full, backflip on its own identity at this stage by shifting from defining itself as 100% British to defining itself as 100% multicultural. Okay, so in the 1970s, you've got a complete inversion of how Australia defines itself, defines its national identity. So basically from a definition that is very homogeneous based on one category to a definition that embraces diversity. Now of course the shift was progressive, but not crazily progressive. As you can see, it happened over roughly 2 decades. And even today, there are some people that question whether or not Australia should be multicultural. Okay, some people on the far right in Australia. But you really need to have this in mind, this very abrupt, in a way, change in how Australia defined itself nationally. Qu'est-ce que j'ai mis? J'ai mis ça. Okay. Yes. This is just a booklet created by the Australian government to explain Australia's multicultural policies to migrants arriving in Australia. Okay, so you can see that Australia is represented through lots of different faces. Since 1972, there have been no restrictions whatsoever on the type of people who can enter Australia. Australia is extremely varied today, very multicultural. I showed you last week where the permanent residents come from. You can see that it's an extremely varied nation today. As part of this varied nation, Aborigines are actually a very small fraction of that population. I mentioned last week that they represent about 2.5% of the population. If we compare this to the number of people that are of Asian origin in Australia today, these people represent about 9% of the population. Okay, so in terms of political weight, the Aboriginal population has very limited political weight compared to most of the other communities that have arrived in Australia since the 1940s. So when you read the novels, try to have this in mind. The novels were written in this period of multicultural Australia. In particular, we'll talk when we get to the Secret River and to Remembering Babylon, we'll talk about the specific historical context. Remembering Babylon in particular was written, well, the Secret River as well actually, were written at very specific times in Australian history, and they respond to a number of debates that were taking place in Australian history about its multicultural identity, about the connection with Aboriginal people and their place in Australian life. But have this in mind that these works were created during multicultural Australia. Remembering Babylon is 1993, The Secret River 2005, so they're rather recent, and they engage with a lot of the issues that affect that multicultural Australia today. Come up. All right. Let's shift to this. About the specificity of settler colonialism, because this is something that you need to really have in mind to understand the novels, to understand where they come from, to also understand Australian culture, because this is at the heart of how Australian culture is structured. So I asked you at home to read the extract on a settler colony. No, je veux pas. So I'm guessing, this is a place, I know there are quite a lot of you, but this is a place where if you have any questions about the documents, do not hesitate to ask. If there's a sentence that you don't understand, a concept that is too difficult for you, we can talk about it together in class. That's not a problem. Did you guys have any questions about this text? Anything that seemed really unclear or that deserved extra explanations? No, I guess it's not one of the most difficult ones that I'll do. If we just go over some of the details of this is something that I've been mentioning since first year, but I'll say it again because I like saying it. You really need to differentiate between two types of colonies, the settler colonies and the colonies of occupation. So the settler colonies being the colonies where people moved to stay, and the colonies of occupation where you had administration coming to basically exploit the native populations or the native resources. Typically, this is the difference between Australia and India. Okay, in India, there was never any discussion of replacing the whole native population. Okay, there's 1 billion of them today. That would be quite difficult. There was never the ambition of the British to replace, to colonize, to settle in that country. The idea was to make profit from the resources that were there, from the labour that was there, etc. In Australia, on the other hand, the aim was to go and settle. That is to create a small, Britain, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific. And this is what we call by settler colonialism. The very specific logic, the very specific mechanisms that exist in settler colonies. Okay, this is what I want to talk about. In particular, one dynamic is this one, of course, is the fact that the invading Europeans annihilated, displaced, and or marginalized the indigenous to become a majority non-indigenous population. The first desire of a settler population when they arrive in a country, we're talking about the US, we're talking about Canada, we're talking about South Africa, we're talking about Australia, New Zealand. The first intent of these populations is to settle, and therefore to replace the population that is there. Replace them either by annihilating them, so getting rid of that population physically, that's genocide, displacing them, pushing them inland, for instance, which is what happened in the US. Je ne sais pas si vous avez beaucoup étudié l'histoire
des États-Unis, notamment l'histoire des populations amérindiennes, mais au départ c'est ce qui se passe. Vous avez une installation sur la côte est, on pousse en fait les Indiens vers l'intérieur du pays, on les pousse. Vous avez la colonisation qui arrive par l'ouest, les Indiens ils se retrouvent au milieu, et c'est là où on commence à les mettre dans des réserves, où on commence à essayer de gérer un petit peu leur présence. D'accord ? Mais il faut vraiment avoir en tête cette idée-là que ces populations, elles viennent pour s'installer, elles viennent surtout pour déplacer les autres. Donc déplacer, ça peut aller de la chose la plus horrible, le génocide, à un déplacement des populations vers d'autres endroits. Et bien sûr, à la fin, quand la frontière se ferme, vous avez une autre façon de gérer les populations natives. You guys are aware that when we speak about the frontier in English, it has a very specific meaning. It's not in the meaning of border. D'accord? Si je traduis frontière en anglais, c'est border. D'accord? Ça va pas être frontier. Frontier is the end, if you want, of an exploration of a country. So in the US, the closing of the frontier is when the whole, what is today the US, was explored and was settled by whites. Okay, that's the closing of the frontier. In Australia, you also had the closing of the frontier, but much later. In the US, it's probably towards the last quarter of the 19th century that you've got the closing of the frontier. In Australia, it's much later in the 1920s, roughly. All right. The other thing that I wanted to highlight in this is this point, which is very present, very controversial in the novel. The fact that there's a very ambivalent position of settlers in settler colonies. I'm not sure if you understood this bit, but the problem for settlers in settler colonies is that they are both colonizer and colonized. You've got this that is explained in there. The fact that they suffer discrimination as colonial subjects themselves, and therefore that in this sense they're simultaneously both colonized and colonizer. Now this is quite easy to understand in the case of Australia. In Australia, the settlers that went to Australia were of course colonizing Aboriginal people, therefore there were colonizers oppressing that population, forcing that population to be displaced. That's pretty easy to understand. On the other hand, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but in the 19th century, it was an insult to call someone a colonial. So people who were born in Australia were considered to be inferior to the people that were born in Britain. And of course, in Australia, you've got something that is referred to as the cultural cringe. Which is basically a feeling of inferiority by Australians that they come from the UK and they're just a derivative society, just a society that is inspired by the UK, but it's not the UK, it's not the UK institutions, it's not all of that. And this was also the case for lots of other colonies. I'm not sure if you know this, but in the Caribbean, the people that were called Creoles in the 19th century, les créoles, d'accord, dans les Caraïbes, en anglais, c'était pas les personnes, maintenant quand on parle du créole, des choses comme ça va plutôt être des personnes qui sont métissées, des choses comme ça. À l'époque, les créoles, c'était les personnes qui étaient nées dans les colonies, qui étaient nées aux Caraïbes et qui avaient un statut très inférieur aux personnes nées au Royaume-Uni qui ensuite auraient émigré aux Caraïbes. Mais il y avait donc cette idée pour les très grandes familles que qu'il fallait que les enfants soient éduqués absolument au Royaume-Uni pour qu'ils n'aient pas ce statut de créole. D'accord? So basically, you do have this very weird binary, this very ambivalent position for the settlers and settler colonies, that they were colonizers themselves, but they also felt colonial, they felt dominated, they felt that they were colonial subjects and therefore inferior. In particular, having a colonial accent was a particularly negative thing. Most of the rich families would send their children to be educated in the UK to get the right accent, to get the right education. Okay, it was not particularly prestigious to go to the Australian universities at that time. Today this has of course changed. Okay, people don't need to go to Oxford or Cambridge or to the UK to feel this. But in the 19th century, there was a very clear sense of cultural cringe, a very clear sense of inferiority, cultural inferiority of the colonial populations. And you'll see that this is very present in the novels. Again, so I don't want to do any spoilers, but in the novels you do have this sense of inferiority. You do have this ambivalence as well of people, of settlers, knowing that they're oppressed, but also feeling oppressed themselves. Okay, and that's a very difficult sort of thing to take into account. Ça va? Alors? Ah, ils se sont pas bien, non? Il a fait une crise cardiaque. Ça va? Ah, ça va mieux. Ou pas? Ça va pas. Ils se sont pas bien. Voilà. Alright. So, if we try to define more clearly the settler colonies. The settler colonies, as I mentioned, represent a specific type of colonization. They include, of course, all of the countries that we've talked about: Australia, the US, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa. You guys know all of this. They also include other places, in particular Hawaii in the United States, which is today an American state, is of course a settler colony that was very fully invaded in a very specific way, very differently from the other states in the US. You also have the Fiji in the Pacific, the Fiji, which are a settler colony, Kenya, which is a settler colony, of course the Caribbean, which are, for most of them, settler colonies. So you've got a definition here of settler colonies, sort of simple definition. You'll see some of the other ones are a bit more complex. So you can see in the simplest terms, settler colonists went and go to new lands to appropriate them and to establish new and improved replicas of the societies they left. As a result, indigenous peoples have found an ever-decreasing place for themselves in settler colonies, as changing demographies enabled ever more extensive dispossessions. Settlers, in the end, tended not to emigrate to assimilate into indigenous societies, but rather emigrated to replace them. So we've talked about this logic of replacement. This, of course, is central to the whole structure of these settler colonies. What we haven't talked about yet is this, the idea that these societies were supposed to be new and improved replicas of the societies they left. Now, in Australia, this took a very clear form. In Australia, there was the idea that Australia should be a better society than the British society had ever been. In Australia, in particular, this took the form of trying to achieve, je dis bien trying, hein? Ça c'est pas trop passé, but trying to achieve a classless society. Now, of course, there are social classes in Australia, but even today, if you speak to Australians, a lot of them do believe that Australia has no social classes, which is so far away from the truth. But this is, if you want, a national myth. It's a little bit like in France, fraternity, freedom, blah, 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 which doesn't actually exist, does it? Now, this, of course, comes from the convict past of Australia. Most of the people that came as convicts came from the lower classes, and when they arrived in Australia, there was a desire from them not to replicate the type of social classes that had existed in the UK. The gold rush was also very important in this ideology of a classless society. Si vous y réfléchissez, c'est quoi une ruée vers l'or? Une ruée vers l'or, c'est un moment où n'importe qui vient de n'importe où, de n'importe quelle classe, peut faire autant d'argent que les autres. D'accord? Tout ce qui compte dans une ruée vers l'or, c'est le travail que vous fournissez et l'intelligence que vous mettez dans votre recherche de l'or. Donc l'idée là-dedans, c'est que c'est vraiment une forme égalitaire en fait de travail où si vous travaillez assez, bon, il y a quand même la chance qui rentre en compte, hein, mais si vous travaillez assez, vous allez pouvoir avoir accès à la richesse. Bien entendu, au Royaume-Uni, la richesse, elle venait de quoi? Elle venait de la terre que vous allez hériter de votre famille. D'accord? Il n'y avait pas du tout accès à la terre au Royaume-Uni parce que toutes les terres étaient monopolisées par la noblesse. Alors que dans des pays comme les États-Unis, comme l'Australie, où il y avait plein de terres qu'on pouvait spolier des populations natives, c'était possible d'avoir un accès à la terre. D'accord? Donc en Australie, vous avez cette idée de créer une société meilleure que celle du Royaume-Uni, une société sans classe, une société où il n'y aurait pas d'aristocratie. Il y a juste le travail et le fait que le travail va vous permettre d'acquérir plus de richesses. Ça, c'est la théorie, hein, c'est l'idéologie qu'il y a en Australie. Bien sûr qu'en Australie, il y a des élites, bien sûr qu'en Australie, il y a en particulier les grandes familles de pastoralistes qui sont extrêmement riches aujourd'hui, etc. Et ça, c'est l'idéologie un petit peu de cette société-là.
I have two other quotes to show you. You'll see that the quotes are more and more complex. These are quotes from someone called Patrick Wolf, who's a historian who works on settler colonialism. This is about the centrality of land in the settler colonial project. Okay, so you've got this here. Whatever settlers may say, and they generally have a lot to say, the primary motive for elimination of native peoples is not race or religion, ethnicity, grade of civilization, etc., but access to territory. Okay, there's a centrality of land in settler colonialism. That's what people come to get. That's what they want to have access to. In sum, then, he says, settler colonialism is an inclusive, land-centered project that coordinates a comprehensive range of agencies from the metropolitan centre to the frontier encampment with a view to eliminating indigenous societies. So I just put in yellow the central words that you guys need to have in mind when you think about settler colonies. First one, access to territory. C'est vraiment ça la clé de la colonisation de peuplement. Le but, c'est d'avoir accès à de la terre. D'accord? La raison pour laquelle on déplace, on opprime, il y a une ségrégation envers les populations autochtones, c'est pour avoir cet accès à la terre. Donc vous pouvez revoir ça ici, land-centered project. It's 100% centered on the land. If you've started the Secret River, or if you're halfway through the Secret River, you know how central the land is for the main character. Here, the fact that settler colonialism coordinates a comprehensive range of agencies. On est d'accord que comprehensive, c'est un faux ami, c'est quoi en français? C'est pas compréhensif alors. Comprehensive, c'est dans le sens exhaustif, d'accord? Donc en gros, what he's trying to say is that this affects all levels of society, all aspects of society. And of course, the priority to eliminating indigenous societies, whether this is done through pushing those populations or physically eliminating them. Okay, so keep this in mind, the centrality of access to land in settler colonialism. So you can see here just a representation of Sturts. Sturt was an explorer who explored a lot of New South Wales. Sturt's party threatened by blacks at the junction of the Murray and Darling, these are two rivers in Australia. In New South Wales in 1830, so you can see, a representation of settler colonial encounters. You've got another representation here, as you can see, this time more with settlers and also soldiers, having a small conflict with the local populations. All right, more quotations, and it'll be less me talking in the next weeks. So here you've got Wolf again saying, settler colonialism has both negative and positive dimensions. Negatively, it strives for the dissolution of native societies. Positively, it erects a new colonial society on the expropriated land base. As I put it, settler colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event. Alors des années, j'ai des étudiants qui viennent me voir à la pause qui font «
quand même, c'est pas positif le fait d'écraser une société et de se mettre partout et de se mettre par-dessus. Ici, il faut vraiment le prendre dans le sens mathématique du terme, d'accord? C'est-à-dire c'est négatif dans le sens j'enlève quelque chose et c'est positif dans le sens je rajoute quelque chose, d'accord? C'est pas un jugement de valeur que ça c'est pas bien et ça c'est bien, d'accord? But you have to see that basically there's a destructive dimension to settler colonialism, but there's also a constructive dimension to it. That is, you try to destroy indigenous societies to build something on top of it. Okay, so that's the whole logic of settler colonialism that, you know, again, if you've started reading the novels, I'm sure you can see quite clearly. So always keep this in mind, that there is a constructive aim, in a way, c'est bizarre de le dire comme ça, but there is a constructive aim to settler colonialism, to build something, to build a new society. However, this positive, this constructive dimension relies on a very negative historical event. How do you guys understand this last bit? This is the most important bit in the quotation. Ça veut dire quoi? Invasion is a structure, not an event. Je pose ma tête, je vois, je vous écoute. Mika?
Invasion is not something that happens in a blink of an eye, it's something that builds up.
Yep, definitely. That the idea that it's not, you know, I can't just go invasion 8041, you know, the 30th of December, this is invasion, full stop. You cannot consider this to be an event, to have a set date. It's something that is a much longer, as you said, process. This word is essential. Invasion in settler colonial societies is not just a long process. Bien sûr que ça met très longtemps. What this quote tells you is that this is a structure for that society. That is, that invasion is the very logic, it's the very structure of these settler colonies. C'est vraiment important de comprendre ça. Que l'invasion, c'est pas juste quelque chose qui se passe à un moment historique. Déjà, on ne peut pas mettre une date dessus. Il faut penser au fait que c'est un long processus, mais surtout, il faut penser au fait que c'est la structure même, c'est la logique même de cette société qui est basée sur l'invasion. D'accord? C'est le processus, enfin non, c'est pas ça, l'invasion, c'est vraiment ce qui structure toute la société dans son ensemble. La société australienne en entier, la société américaine en entier sont structurées autour de ce processus d'invasion, de dépossession, possession. So you really need to consider that these cultures are basically, well, historically structured around this, and that the very basis of their culture, the very basis of these histories is that invasion, dispossession, this negative and positive aspect that actually go together. D'accord? Tout ce qui est positif dans ces sociétés implique nécessairement la destruction de ce qui existait avant. C'est-à-dire que dès que je me réfère à quelque chose qui a été construit, qui est positif dans la société australienne, je fais appel par implication à ce qui a été détruit, qui était avant. Ça, c'est le problème, on va dire, le gros problème historique de ces sociétés, où tout ce qui est construit, en fait, c'est basé sur une logique de destruction. D'accord? C'est une logique, en fait, qui structure toute la société, toute la mentalité de la société, et c'est un sujet extrêmement sensible en Australie. D'accord? Un petit peu comme, je sais pas, les guerres d'Algérie en France. Mais c'est quelque chose que you really have to live it to feel it. I taught history in Australia at university, and the face of students, like the reaction of students when we talked about indigenous populations was just really surprising. These were students that were very open, that would talk about anything for hours. It was very difficult to stop them from talking, and the unease that went through the classroom when we started talking about this was actually incredible to watch. There is a very strong sense of unease at this idea that wrong was done towards the indigenous population and that the whole society is based on that. This is something very uneasy to go over. This is a question that people in France do not ask. In France, colonial and metropolitan histories are separated. When we teach them, they're 100% separated, when actually the empire was immensely important in the wealth that France had. But this is a question that is avoided in France. It's just swept under the carpet. In Australia, you can't sweep it under the carpet. It's the Constitution of Australia, the very creation of Australia. You cannot avoid that question. Alright, so, je sais pas pourquoi j'ai mis ça. Let's do a final quote and then we'll go on, oh yeah, this one's good, and then we'll go on a break because I think that I will have spoken quite a lot. So, cadeau pour la pause. Settler colonialism does not simply replace native society tout court. Rather, the process of replacement maintains the refractory imprint of the native counterclaim. Je laisse 2 minutes pour vous exploser le cerveau là-dessus. What do you guys think this means? Ouais, c'est pas sympa, mais on a une pause à faire.
I don't know completely, but I think what it's meant here, it means the settler doesn't mean to wipe out the native society completely. It's just to reform them.
Okay, not quite this. They're not that nice. But nicely tried. Nice try. What do you guys think?
I mean, probably the process is so deep that it replaces the native society, but it also makes sure that the claims, they sweep the claims as well. You know what I mean? Don't talk about this anymore. It's done. That's the base of our society.
Okay.
Don't talk about indigenous Australia anymore. No?
Okay, that is the attitude actually in Australia. That was the attitude for a long time. That Australian histories were written in such a way that Indigenous people were just mentioned as a detail in Australian history, and that the whole of Australian history was meant to start in 1788 with the glorious arrival of Europeans. That's not quite what the quote says, but that is true about the Australian context. It is true in Australia, we'll talk about this some more later, but they talk about collective a form of collective amnesia, that is the desire not to speak about this period. It is true that it's a very difficult question to face as a nation, this idea of eliminating indigenous societies, and people speak about that. This was called denounced by a very famous anthropologist. You guys don't need to remember his name, called Stana. This was denounced by him in the 1950s as the Great Australian Silence. That is, that in Australian history, in Australian society, people do not speak about the indigenous populations. Of course, today this is no longer the case. Okay, since the 1980s in particular, there's been a lot that has been done to change this. So Australia has evolved quite a lot. But he denounced that Great Australian Silence on those moments in Australian history, in particular on frontier violence, on the violence that was done to Indigenous populations, and on the very place of Indigenous people in Australia. All right. Now, what this means is actually not that difficult, is phrased in a weird way. Basically, what this means is that the logic of settler colonialism is to replace. You've got a base, you're supposed to replace it. What he's saying is that it's not just replacement. That is, you've got the indigenous base. Settler colonialism is not just, let's get rid of this, we've got a new society. Settler colonialism is, we've got this, we're trying to build something on top of it, but within this very society is contained this destruction. Okay, this is what the quote says, that you've got within that process of replacement, you can never replace 100%, even if you destroy entirely those populations. Within the construction of the society, contained within it, you've got the idea that replacement, that violence that was done to Indigenous people, that is basically constitutive of that society. D'accord? L'idée c'est que vous n'avez pas un remplacement pur et simple. Vous n'avez pas juste des populations qui sont là, on les fout de côté, on crée une nouvelle société qui se bat et qui part sur des bases saines, en gros. D'accord? Ce qui se passe, c'est qu'on remplace une société Cette deuxième société, elle existe que basée sur quoi? Sur l'élimination de l'autre. C'est-à-dire qu'on ne peut jamais effacer, en fait, quelque part la légitimité des populations autochtones à être là, à avoir été là. D'accord? C'est ça que vous avez. The fact that the process of replacement maintains an imprint, quand ça garde quelque part une marque qui, alors refractory, là juste maintenant, non, une marque, on va dire qui se reflète un petit peu de biais, d'accord, garde cette marque-là des protestations des autochtones, d'accord. C'est-à-dire que cette société, on ne peut pas juste effacer ces autochtones. Vous avez cette société australienne qui en fait toute sa structure, elle est basée, toute son existence, elle est basée sur cette violence-là. Vous ne pouvez pas enlever cette violence, vous ne pouvez pas considérer la société australienne sans considérer qu'elle va avec cette violence-là. D'accord? C'est un peu ce dont on parlait un petit peu avant avec le positif et le négatif. Ça va? Or should I explain this again? Les mains, c'était bien. Alright, let's take a 5-minute break.
Acheté la version
Kindle.
Mais le problème avec l'examen, sur l'examen, on a besoin de livres.
Ah bon?
Je pense.
Je suis pas sûr parce qu'on va faire un commentaire de texte d'une dissertation.
Je pense
qu'elle va donner des.
On a besoin de ça, juste.
Oui, je crois que c'est bon. Je crois que c'est bon. Et tu as déjà commencé?
Oui, mais je suis là. Mais je sais pas c'est où. Ah.
C'est quelle partie?
London.
Ah oui. J'ai terminé la partie London. Je suis dans la partie Sydney. J'ai bientôt fini la partie Sydney.
Ah oui, je pense que c'est ici.
Ah mais c'est bien cette version Kindle parce que tu l'achètes, tu l'as tout de suite.
Oui, mais moi j'ai besoin de lire cette page. Je commence partout, c'est bien.
Mais le début Part 1 London, c'est vraiment très intéressant parce que ça met le contexte, ça met ça t'explique qui sont les personnages en fait.
Oui, c'est vrai.
Et du coup après pour la partie Sydney, on les connaît, c'est mieux. Il faut vraiment lire London d'abord parce qu'après.
Et qu'est-ce qui se passe dans partout dans le parti
ils arrivent en
Australie.
Oui.
Mais je pense que
ils découvrent un autre monde en fait, parce qu'ils sont habitués au monde de Londres, des petites maisons sales, moches, ils sont pauvres, ils n'ont rien à manger, ils sont obligés de voler à Londres.
Mais je veux savoir que je pense, parce que j'ai pas fini à la dernière de part de London, je pense que parce que il est voleur. Oui. Mais j'ai pas compris. Il a tué son ami avant
I'm not sure he actually killed anyone. Did he kill someone? I must have missed this.
J'ai pensé ici.
Où ça?
No, pas Luca. There in tandem cell. Calvert Beck thrown to buy him a quick death, and for all time's sake, Thornhill did. Mais dans la page suivante, elle a dit, but it seems that Mr. Executor had done his sons wrong after all.
Oh no, I know why. Because he wanted to bribe the executioner to give him money. To kill him like quickly. No?
Ah, ok.
kill him quickly.
Ah,
But
okay.
the executioner didn't do it, so it actually dies very slowly.
Ah ouais.
That's how, yeah, he
Ouais,
didn't
ouais,
kill
ouais.
anyone.
Oui,
I
parce
thought-
que j'ai pensé que...
No, he didn't kill anyone. He's gonna be sent to Australia. Have you been to that part already?
Non.
He's been sent to Australia because he stole something. It's just
Ouais.
a theft. He stole something, you will see what, and got deported to Australia.
Oui,
And when he
c'est à
arrived,
cause de... Oui, c'est à
d'un
cause
vol.
de... Au vol, il a...
mais, and then it's gonna. I mean, the Sydney part is very interesting because it's like a new world. There's something that they don't know. They haven't seen that before. It's the weather,
Mais
the
c'est la
landscape, everything.
Ouais. Mais la première part, il y a aussi dans l'Australie.
Ah oui, mais ça c'est
Strangers.
l'introduction. Oui, c'est l'introduction. Ça c'est quand il rencontre un. C'est la première rencontre avec un Aboriginal.
Mais la version Kindle a quelque chose comme ça. Tu vois, je veux savoir qu'il y a dans le livre ou non. Attends, ici, oui. Non. Oh, ouais. All
Oh, that's
time
very
people
nice.
turn.
That's very nice.
Really?
That's very interesting.
There are not in the book?
No.
Oh, ok, c'est good. C'est bon.
You don't have this in the book.
Yeah. Parce que ici, c'est à Sydney, London, Thames, Gentry, Moon. Et ici, c'est People, William Thornhill, Smasher. Je pense qu'il y a des caractères aux personnages. Ici, c'est All Item.
Yeah.
Mais c'est long.
Oui, mais c'est parce que peut-être que oui, c'est des définitions en fait. Ça te dit.
Par exemple, Sarah. When Lizzie played mother to John and then to baby Luke after that, Lizzie's friend Sal from Swan Lane became sister to William.
Oui, c'est un petit peu compliqué, non? It's just
Mais
the only thing you need to know is that it's his wife. I mean,
Yeah. Ça,
Point. Period.
c'est
That's
femme.
it.
Oui, oui,
No,
c'est vrai.
I mean-
Oui, c'est vrai. Parce que si tu vraiment si tu lis attentivement le livre, tu peux par exemple la relation entre personnes,
Oui,
entre
oui, oui.
les gens. Mais c'est pour ça il explique la relation entre les gens.
Oui, non, c'est sûr. Mais c'est intéressant qu'il y ait ça.
Ouais.
Non, il n'y a pas ça dans le livre.
Ok,
So
c'est
we
bon.
are going to continue talking about settler colonialism. That's all we'll do today. What I want to talk about now is the various types of strategies that are used by settlers to eliminate indigenous societies. Now we've talked about the fact that elimination or replacement is at the heart of settler colonialism, and settler colonialism basically rearranges places, it rearranges peoples, and it does that through a number of strategies. The first strategy that we need to mention is the legal strategies that are used by settlers to basically gain space. We can mention treaties, we can mention the purchase of land, and in some other cases, and this was the case in Australia, just the fact of taking the land. You know that in the US there were a lot of treaties that were signed with the native populations. This was the case as well in New Zealand, where there was a treaty, and then when the land was acquired by paying money to the indigenous population. Of course, the money that was paid was very small compared to what the land was actually worth, and most of the people did not understand what they were selling for what price. But you've got lots of different strategies for this. What you do have in settler colonialism is a legal framework. Settlers usually bring with them their legal system. And within that legal system, most of the time, indigenous people find themselves marginalized.
So I want to speak about settler colonialism generally now, and then I'll explain to you how this worked exactly in Australia. But just to give you an example, in Australia, a lot of Aboriginal people today talk about a country where you actually have two laws. That is the Australian common law, which is the judicial system in Australia, common law, and what they call Aboriginal law. Okay, so in the opinion of Aborigines, there is such a thing as Aboriginal law, except that this is not recognised by Australian common law. Okay, so you can see that there are some things that just don't make any sense in settler colonies. The fact that within those countries, you've got settlers bringing their own legal system, and within that legal system, dispossessing the indigenous populations. Okay, so there are very clear legal strategies that are used to dispossess these people. Another, possibly the most obvious strategy that is used are physical strategies. Now, of course, settler colonialism includes people going to a country, so massive populations going, settling in places. We can mention all of the things that I've mentioned before, that is pushing natives inland, possibly displacing them, putting them in reserves, okay, or segregating them, controlling where they go. That's, of course, a physical strategy. And, of course, the most extreme physical strategy is destroying people physically. Okay, so the murder, the killing of native populations. As part of physical strategy, we also need to mention less impressive, if you want, but very, very symbolic strategies. We can mention, for instance, fencing. D'accord, juste le fait de poser des limites physiques à un espace. The fact of fencing is a physical strategy to try to keep native populations out, but also to claim a land for yourself. Okay? Imagine Australia not having any particular fences or things like that. Imagine this and what this creates. Planting as well is a way of appropriating the ground, d'accord, le fait de planter, de mettre en place. C'est bête, hein, mais si vous avez un champ, ça veut dire que vous délimitez une parcelle que vous considérez comme étant la vôtre. Vous pouvez mettre, qu'est-ce que j'ai dit, comment ça s'appelle fencing? Vous pouvez mettre des barrières pour délimiter ça, mais vous pouvez aussi, l'action de planter fait que ça va être votre espace, vous vous appropriez cet espace, vous forcez l'utilisation de cet espace. Donc ça, c'est toutes des stratégies légales pour pousser aussi les populations autochtones, pour aussi les déposséder un petit peu de l'utilisation de ces terres-là. Parce que si vous plantez un champ de maïs, sur ce champ de maïs, on ne peut pas faire grand-chose d'autre que récupérer le maïs. D'accord? So you've got lots of more subtle, if you want, more everyday life strategies that exist. So we can mention the streets as well. Property boundaries, so we've talked about this, fencing, the name of streets, and there is the very strong importance of naming. Last week we talked about the name of the colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, d'accord, ça ne s'appelle pas avec des noms aborigènes. Clairement, vous avez un remplacement un petit peu, quand on va nommer quelque chose, on se l'approprie quelque part, on le définit, et quand on donne que des noms de choses britanniques, et bien quelque part vous forcez l'imposition d'une identité britannique, vous êtes en train de remplacer. C'est ce dont on parlait la semaine dernière, vous vous rappelez, je vous ai dit que Uluru, le caillou, maintenant ça s'appelle Uluru, pendant très longtemps ça s'appelait Ayers Rock, d'accord, comme si ce truc-là il n'était pas connu des populations autochtones depuis des milliers d'années. So renaming is extremely important. You'll see this in the novel, how things are named very often based on British references. And if you take a map of Australia, things have evolved today, but in Australia most of the names are actually names that come from Britain, even the names of the major cities. Sydney and Melbourne are names for lords that were governors. In Australia, Perth is a city in Scotland. All of these names actually exist. they're either the names of famous people or the name of places that already exist. If you take, it's quite funny because I know Australia better than I know London, so when I go to London I'm like, wait a second, that's a suburb in Melbourne. Like, why? But it's actually the other way around. Then you've got Footscray. Footscray is a place that actually exists in the southern UK. You've got lots of names that are used like that. And of course this is highly symbolic and highly efficient. The final strategy that I want to talk about is a discursive strategy. Now we can include naming as part of this. But the most obvious discursive strategy is the one that is described better than what I could ever say in the document that you've got in your fascicule, document 8 on colonial discourse. Je vous laisse 5 minutes pour lire, ce n'est pas un texte très très long. definition of colonial discourse. It's important for you guys to understand that in French we only have one word for this. Discours et discours dans le sens philosophique du terme et discours dans le sens of speech. In English you actually have a very different meaning. You don't say people, discourse. This doesn't make any sense. Discourse is used most of the time in a philosophic sort of dimension, a little bit like this. It's a little bit, I guess, difficult to understand, but discourse is about a system of representation. It's the sort of ideology that you can formulate about a world. Okay, you've got... This is the definition of discourse that is probably the clearest in a way to me. Discourse is a system by which dominant groups in society constitute the field of truth by imposing specific knowledges, disciplines, and values upon dominated groups. Discourse operates at all levels in society. There is a specific type of discourse that exists in our Western society, which is based on individualism, it's based on making money will make you happy, spending money will also make you happy. Okay? In our cultures, there's a very strong centrality of the capitalist system. In a way, because we're born into it, this surrounds us all the time. If you just stop for a minute and watch the ads that you're watching, consider the stupidity of what you're being told in these ads. Like, if you get this car, you are going to get a woman, you are going to be super cool, you are going to have a social life, okay? The sheer stupidity of that discourse should be very clear to you, because, you know, you can cut this out if you want next time you watch ads, and consider just how very immensely stupid and insulting they actually are to our intelligence. But discourse exists in any society, in any context. It's basically the system of values, the system of beliefs that are considered to be the truth. Okay, so in our systems, it's very clear that insistence on money and on the importance of money in making us happy, in realizing our lives, is what dominates in our societies. Now, in a society that is colonial, discourse functions in a specific way. That is, that you've got a dominant group, the colonizers, that are going to say specific things, to use specific images to speak about themselves and to speak about the colonized. Okay, this is what colonial discourse is about. And very often, colonial discourse is going to create a very clear binary between colonizers and colonized. Le système colonial ne peut pas exister sans coloniser. Donc il y a besoin qu'il y ait une limite infranchissable qui soit tracée entre les colonisateurs et les colonisés. Sinon, vous n'avez pas de situation de colonisation, ça n'existe pas. Okay, the system requires a binary separation between colonized and colonizer. And that binary separation exists at a physical level. We've talked about fencing, we've talked about segregation. It also exists at a very linguistic, discursive level. I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that a lot of colonized people have been described as primitive, uncivilized, uneducated, savage, what have you, and the colonizers are of course described as civilized, evolved, scientifically developed, etc., etc. You really need to take into account the fact that domination is not just a physical event. Domination mostly takes place through discursive positions. Okay? The discourse around it is extremely important. Si je parle de quelque chose que vous connaissez peut-être, je fais des grands sauts à travers plein de choses, mais il y a un discours par exemple qui existe sur la pauvreté. Il y a un discours qui existe par exemple sur le chômage. Monsieur Macron, la semaine dernière, a dit « Moi, je fais un service, je trouve un boulot, machin, machin ». Ça, c'est quoi? Ça, c'est une culpabilisation des personnes qui sont au chômage. C'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a pas de droit d'être au chômage. Quelque part, il y a une honte à être au chômage. Ça, c'est un discours qui est imposé, d'accord, pour forcer un petit peu les gens à aller prendre des boulots de merde, payés comme des merdes, dans le monde de la restauration, où il y a la pire convention collective qui peut exister en France. Voilà, quand on est président de la République, c'est assez facile à dire. Mais vous avez un discours qui existe sur la pauvreté, qui est que quelque part les gens qui sont pauvres, c'est des gens qui n'ont pas assez travaillé. D'accord? Alors qu'on sait très bien que la pauvreté, quand elle est intergénérationnelle, c'est quelque chose qui est très très difficile à enlever et qu'il y a plein de structures dans la société qui font que quand vous êtes né pauvre, bah, c'est difficile de bouger de ça parce qu'il y a plein de barrières, on va dire, institutionnelles qui sont là pour vous empêcher de monter. Alors que la France est quand même beaucoup moins coincée de ce côté-là qu'un pays comme les États-Unis où là il y a encore plus de barrières institutionnelles. Mais il y a un discours qui existe sur la pauvreté qui n'a rien à voir avec les raisons réelles de la pauvreté, d'accord? Qui ne sont pas une question de la personne n'a pas envie, ou elle a la flemme, ou ah, c'est génial d'avoir le RSA. Il n'y a pas beaucoup de personnes qui ont envie d'avoir juste le RSA et de vivre leur vie comme ça, d'accord? Donc il faut comprendre que le discours, le système, on va dire, that system of truth, of imposing a specific type of knowledge, a specific way of viewing the world exists at all sorts of different levels. And you guys really need to have in mind the fact that it works in a specific way in a colonial situation through that colonial discourse. So of course you've got in that paragraph here lots of examples of what this discourse can contain. Okay, so these are just examples, but you can see, you can imagine of course the centrality of Europe in there, Europe being considered as the most advanced culture that has a right to colonize others because it's so much better. Okay, this is just justifying oppression, that's all it is, but this is where discourse is important. You also can see the fact that very often colonial discourse contains assumptions about history, about language, literature, technology. Pourquoi est-ce qu'une société qui saurait, je sais pas, créer un train à vapeur, c'est une société qui est forcément plus intéressante, plus à sauver qu'une société individualiste qui met l'argent en avant, etc., qui n'a pas tellement de valeur et qui arrive à créer des trains, c'est plus intéressant qu'une société qui est collectiviste et qui peut avoir des valeurs de partage. Je sais pas, d'accord? Mais ça, c'est la façon dont la colonisation elle a conduit, de dire que le progrès technologique, c'est ce qui est le plus intéressant dans tout. Donc une société qui a le progrès technologique, elle peut opprimer une autre société au nom de ça, au nom de lui imposer ça, au nom d'imposer de l'hygiène, de la médecine, des choses comme ça. D'accord? Donc ça, c'est un fonctionnement de la domination, d'accord, qui passe par un aspect discursif. Of course, all of this is based on this assumption of the superiority of the colonizer's culture, history, language, art, political structures, social conventions, etc. Why are we talking about this? We're talking about this because we've got novels that come from that deal with the 19th century, therefore that contain colonial discourse and that try to question it. You'll see in particular in The Secret River that there's a questioning of who is the primitive or the uncivilized and who is the civilized population. There's a lot in that novel that tries to question that line. Is it the Aborigines that are truly uncivilized, or is it actually the settlers that are the ones that are truly uncivilized? Okay, so you've got a questioning of that colonial discourse. That's why you guys need to have in mind how it works, so you can really see how it's being broken down in there. So, yes. Do you guys have any questions about this? Don't hesitate if something is not clear, I'm not sure. So, okay? So, you know, again, when we speak about the novels, really have this in mind. In particular, this will be quite valid for The Secret River. The various strategies, they are very clearly legal, physical and discursive strategies in The Secret River to displace the Aboriginal population to constitute legitimacy for the main character. Okay? Domination is not just about weapons. The strongest form of domination is through education. So it's through education, and it is also through discourse. Okay? Those values that we're being bombarded with, and that we sort of accept as being the basic values in our society. Alright, and that's just the opening photo I had. You can see here an Aboriginal family at a white settler farm. You can see the simplicity of the house that was built, and you can of course see the difference in modes of living there. Alright, so I want to speak about Australian settler colonialism. Now, everything that we've said about settler colonialism does work for Australia. I just want to talk about two main specificities in Australia about its settler colonialism. Ah, pourquoi j'ai mis ça? Hop là. So similar settler colonial dynamics in Australia. Il y a des jours comme ça, je mets plein de trucs sur les PowerPoint. Des jours j'en ai pas. Now, you've got two very clear specificities in Australia. The first one is this, the difficult appropriation of the land. Now, the land was very difficult to appropriate in Australia for lots of different reasons. Now, first, the land itself in Australia is, well, what can I say? Settlers basically had very little knowledge of that land. Okay, we talked about this last week, but the trees are different, the berries, les fruits que vous pouvez récolter are different, the animals are different. It's actually quite difficult to know what you can eat, what you can't eat. As you know, there are a lot of deadly things around in Australia, spiders, snakes, the top 10 snakes, top 10 deadly snakes and spiders in Australia. So obviously nature in Australia is not as welcoming, if you want, as it is in what is today the eastern United States. So there was a real problem with the knowledge of local foods, real problem with the knowledge of local plants. The soil, le sol, d'accord, dans le sens agriculture, the soil is actually very different from British soils. So it was difficult as well to find what would actually grow in Australia and what would not grow. And in the early days of colonization, of course, they were bringing seeds. D'accord, ils amenaient les graines by boat. Okay, so they were waiting for the seeds to actually come by boat to be able to then actually sow them into the fields. With the years, they were able to reuse seeds from previous fields, but basically the colonizers were trying to, well, basically have the lifestyle they had in Europe, in Australia. And you might be aware of the fact that a lot of the things that were introduced in Australia, so foreign trees, foreign plants, foreign animals in particular, had a devastating impact on the Australian countryside. D'accord, l'Australie, enfin forcément, si vous amenez plein d'espèces étrangères, d'accord, le chêne, il n'est pas natif de l'Australie, il y en a plein, le platane, qu'est-ce qu'il fout en Australie, mais vous aviez vraiment l'importation en fait de beaucoup d'espèces, et notamment de maïs, de choses comme ça, ça a eu un effet monstrueux sur l'environnement en Australie. You might be aware of the example of rabbits? No? In Australia there was a pastoralist who enjoyed rabbits and who asked for rabbits to be brought on a boat for 8 months, all the way to Australia, and he actually released them into the wild. Since in the 19th century, since then Australia has been plagued by rabbits. There's been a fence that was built in Western Australia that is thousands of kilometers long to keep the rabbits from entering Western Australia, because basically the rabbits eat the shoots, ils mangent les petites pousses, and because the native plants are not, or did not have anything that was eating native shoots, they're basically destroyed by the presence of the rabbits. So in fact, what biologists consider is the fact that in the 19th century there would have been less semi-desertic areas in Australia. A lot of these semi-desertic areas were created by the importation of species, in particular cows. Si vous réfléchissez 2 secondes, les animaux natifs en Australie, les plus lourds, c'est les kangourous. Ils ne sont pas tous très grands. Une vache, c'est énorme. En fait, ça a écrasé beaucoup du topsoil, d'accord, du sol du haut, et donc ça écrase la possibilité en fait de régénération de ces plantes-là. Donc il y a une désertification qui a eu lieu avec l'importation de ces espèces. Bref, let's go back to our topic. But basically, a difficult appropriation of the land. In Australia as well, there are a lot of floods, there are a lot of droughts, so nature can be very violent. Un orage, c'est un orage, hein? So floods, vous vous rappelez, c'est une inondation. Drought, on en a parlé, c'est la sécheresse la semaine dernière, so lots of floods, lots of droughts. It actually took a long time for colonizers to be able to understand and to know how to deal with. There was also this process of knowing the land needed Aboriginal knowledge. Okay, so there was originally, and you can see this in The Secret River if you started reading it, there was actually exchange of knowledge where Aborigines allowed colonizers to know more about the land. But the fact that settlers did not know how to use the land was of course a constant reminder that this was not their land, that they were not supposed to be there. So the relationship with the land is very ambiguous in Australia, in that settlers came to get the land, but in a way the land kept reminding them that they're not the native population, they're not the population that understands how to work the land, and they rely on Aboriginal knowledge very heavily to be able to use that land. Okay, so land, in a way, is, you know, that's what we talked about, that in the process of replacement, you always have that destruction of Indigenous societies that exists. This is the same in the land. You get the land, you cultivate the land, but in a way the land reminds you of who was basically there in the first place. So very ambiguous relation to the land. So I just got you a couple of images. This is a typical image of the bush, the Australian bush. You can see the gum trees, the tortured trees. Colonists actually also had a hard time dealing with the aesthetic qualities of the Australian landscape because of course it looks nothing like Britain, it's not green, it's not lush, it's very different. Okay, c'est pas une nature luxuriante comme on peut avoir en Europe au printemps, etc. And then this, for instance, are berries that you can eat in Australia. Ça s'appelle du bush tucker, ce qu'on peut manger dans le bush. D'accord, ça va être comme ça. Tucker, c'est le mot utilisé souvent par les aborigènes pour parler de la nourriture. D'accord. So bush tucker. As you can see, I'm sure none of you guys can identify what these are. Of course, try to project yourself in what it was to try a berry and be sick, or see someone die and then consider that you should not be eating this. The second specificity is something that we've talked about before if you were here in L1. These are the legal terms of colonization in Australia. Now you guys might remember this vaguely or not, but basically Australia had a very specific legal status throughout colonization until 1992. Australia was considered legally a terra nullius. We've got it on the board here. That is that in Australia, legally, Australia was considered to have been empty when the colonizers arrived. C'est débile, mais c'est ce qui s'est passé. So Australia was legally considered a terra nullius. Remember what we talked about before about how settlers bring their own legal system and then use that legal system to dispossess Aboriginal people. C'est ce que vous avez ici. D'accord? Le fait de définir l'Australie comme étant terra nullius, considérer que légalement il n'y avait pas d'habitants et que donc quand ces habitants ils font une demande de reconnaissance de la terre, vous faites mais attendez, terra nullius, vous n'existez pas. D'accord? Vous utilisez votre propre système légal en fait pour marginaliser et pour empêcher ces personnes de récupérer, on va dire, de la terre ou alors une forme de citoyenneté. So you do have in Australia a very specific use of the legal system to gain power in Australia. That was achieved through terra nullius by defining legally that land as having just nomadic peoples that could just be pushed further away. Whereas we know that, of course, Aboriginal people have a specific land, they go around it depending on the seasons, but they're very attached to their lands. This can, for instance, be compared to what happened in New Zealand or what happened in the US, where in both contexts you actually had treaties that were signed. In Australia, well, there are actually two treaties that were never considered legal enough. Okay, so Australia was 100% terra nullius. But of course, in these countries where you had treaties that were signed, this did not mean that colonization was fair, que la colonisation était juste. C'est juste que les rouages de l'appropriation de la terre étaient différents. C'est les traités qui ont permis en fait de déposséder ces populations de leurs terres par rapport à l'Australie où on considérait juste que les populations n'existaient pas. C'est un peu moins chiant en termes de coût. Alright, so in New Zealand where you had What should we mention? Yeah. Oh well. In New Zealand, we had a treaty that was signed. Now, terra nullius existed until 1992, when there was the end of a big trial where an Aboriginal, well, several Aboriginal people questioned the very existence of terra nullius. Vous vous rappelez peut-être dans des souvenirs très vagues que ça s'appelle Mabo, d'accord, ce procès-là. So the end of the Mabo trial in 1992, which led to a law, the Native Title Act, that basically gave a right to Aboriginal people to request land. And this law also recognized the fact that Australia was never truly a terra nullius. But until 1993, you can see that Australia had that legal status. So that's a very important specificity. It was very difficult for Aboriginal people to make claims because they were neither recognized as citizens, nor were they recognized as being there before. Therefore, in Australian law, they had no right to the land whatsoever that was recognized until 1992. Okay, so it's very important to keep this in mind, this context. Full stop. And we're not reading Remembering Babylon just yet, I imagine, but Remembering Babylon was published in 1993. So Remembering Babylon was published exactly at that moment when terra nullius was about to be declared as being a void and as being something that should be gotten rid of. Okay, so there's a very strong, very particular context to Remembering Babylon. Remembering Babylon was also published in particular around the bicentenary. 1988, c'était le bicentenaire de la colonisation en Australie, et vous imaginez qu'il y ait pas mal de débats à ce moment-là, en particulier les aborigènes qui questionnaient le fait qu'on puisse célébrer 2 centenaires de colonisation. Ça a vraiment été célébré en grande pompe en Australie, ils n'ont pas été super intelligents là-dessus. Mais énorme fête, machin, pendant des années, etc. Enfin, pendant 1 an, 2 ans, il y a eu énormément de choses autour du bicentenaire. Un petit peu, je ne sais pas s'il y en avait certains d'entre vous qui étaient à l'école quand il y avait le bicentenaire de la Révolution. Waouh, c'était pénible. Ça ne devait pas être le... Enfin, bref. Oui, et donc you have this whole context of the bicentenary of Mabo for Remembering Babylon. So Remembering Babylon was published in a very sort of important moment, important change in Australia. Ça, on s'en fout. Hop. Alright. Sorry. Something happened. Okay. So, to conclude on our little class today. Another quote and then a little painting. So you can see here, this is a quote from someone else. You can see here that Emma Cox says, the inclusion of non-white histories is part of blah terms, of what blah terms the politics of forgetting necessary for purified, imaginative processes of nation building, as well as the practical consolidation of sovereignty. Try to remember this idea, the fact that for Australia to be able to live with its very heavy history for a long time, and even today, you have politics of forgetting. That is what we were talking about before, that great Australian silence, the fact that it's easier not to ask too many questions, not to try to know too much about this period of frontier violence. Now, for a long time, Australian history was marked by this, a politics of forgetting. And you'll see in the novels, I'm not sure if you've read all of The Secret River, right at the end, you can consider that there you've got the perfect example of the politics of forgetting. We'll talk about it some more when we get to the novel. But keep this in mind, the fact that forgetting is an essential part of Australian history. Things have been re-established, especially in the 1990s and in the year 2000. But in Australia, nation building is they often try to disconnect the building of the Australian nation from the violence that happened. Well, as we talked about today, these are actually intimately connected. You cannot detach one from the other. And you'll see this is very much what is being said, in short, in The Secret River. So to finish today, I've got a little painting for you guys. This is the landing of Captain Cook at Botany Bay in 1770 when New South Wales was proclaimed British. What are your thoughts on this? shocks you? Find Aboriginal people.
At the back.
Okay, at the back. What can we say about their representation?
They're aggressive people.
I think they're just hunting shit on
Are they not hunting British people?
No, I don't think they're hunting British people. That would have been a very different type of I think they're just hunting kangaroos.
Oh yeah,
or
there are
something.
some things.
Okay. What else would you say about how Aborigines are represented in this?
They don't have any identity. They are shown as very dark. We can't see their faces.
Shadows.
So we don't know who they are. Maybe savages.
Yep, they're pretty much generic, as you said. We can't really see their faces. What else?
James Cook is protecting them.
Yeah,
No?
James Cook is surrounded by a whole lot of people. But I
It's
think
sort of
they're
protected
really-
them, no?
Huh?
They want to. That guy kneeling on the floor, he wants to shoot them,
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
James
Oh, yeah,
Cook is
that's fair enough.
protecting them somehow.
I think James
No.
Cook is going, this is land, this is British land. I think that's what he's doing. He's like, this will be wonderful for our queen. I think that's the action of claiming the land, I think. Or surveying, and like, because his expedition was about seeing whether the land was worth claiming. So when he came back, if you read Cook's journals, you can find them online, he actually details all of the resources that they can find, because that was the idea of colonization, like, ooh. So he said, oh, there are lots of good, trees and forests and stuff. You can get lots of good wood from here. So that's what he's doing, probably like, many here. That's pretty much it. Here behind it. Just simplifie un peu le sens. Okay, but yes, I agree with you. There's this bloke here that is keeping the Aborigines in check, just in case they get a bit aggressive. What else?
They are pushed towards the right side of the
Frame?
It's good symbolically speaking that their time in Australia has come to an end.
Okay, alright, sure, why not? I guess more simplistically we can say that your gaze, if you look at this painting, does not go directly to them. They're very much marginalized. Okay, most of us will go probably towards, if you look at this, you'll probably look at either Cook or the flag. That's the first thing you'll look at. A lot of us read from left to right, okay, considering our writing. So therefore, they're in the most marginal spot in the painting. They could have been down there as well. That would have been pretty marginal, but probably too much in the foreground for people. I think another thing you can say is just the size. If you consider the comparative size of the Aboriginal people in this with the comparative size of Cook, you can see that Aboriginal people are just there to indicate where we are. Okay, they're here as an indication of the location. We are in Australia. These are almost, they could have put a kangaroo there that would have had the same role. Okay, as you said, as someone said, I can't remember who, they're devoid of individuality. We have no idea who these people are. They've got no specific identity. They're just there to mark this. And when we talk about the Great Australian Silence, you can have this in mind, that for a very long time, this was how Aboriginal people were represented in Australia, just as a background, background to colonisation in Australia, nothing central to Australian history. Again, this has changed quite a lot today. There's a lot more recognition of Aboriginal people in Australia. But keep this in mind, that for a long time Australian history was white Australian history, not Aboriginal history. Ça va? Eh bien, chers amis, vos petits devoirs pour la semaine prochaine. Lisez The Secret River. Je vous dis qu'il meurt à la fin. Attention, vous voulez que ça ait un intérêt. Lisez-le, c'est vraiment important. Et faites une liste des personnages principaux. La semaine prochaine, ce sera un petit peu moins CM. Et les semaines d'après aussi, on pourra plus communiquer et parler du roman. Ça marche? See you next week.
Do you know if it's still the same place we're going for the phonetics?
No.
I think it has changed.
No,
You said that
yeah.
you wanted to change. No, still, it's the I have the same.
Still
the saying.
Excusez-moi. Je voulais vous demander où est votre bureau?
Pardon, je comprends pas.
Votre bureau ici?
C'est en haut en 252.
252.
Ouais, c'est ça.
Ouais. Je veux parler avec la oui, oui, politique, mais...